remember that the purpose of study is, at least in part, the fact that we do not have all the answers. We are not attempting merely to communicate that which is already clearly known, but to search in the mystery and maze of the world's experience for things that are not too well known, in the hope of bringing clarification. And by clarification we mean to bring forth out of ourselves additional resources with which to cope with the unknown. What we call growth, as far as knowledge is concerned, is the gradual conquest of mystery, in which by degrees we become sufficiently informed and sufficiently astute in our own contemplative faculties so that we can approach the unknown with organization and help to simplify and clarify various doubts that may previously exist. So when we begin to study the planetary theology of ancient peoples, we are not in possession of all of the facts that we would like to have available. Two problems are presented by this situation. In the first place, we are not certain that ancient man was in a position to articulately clarify his own position. A great many of his findings were held intuitively by a kind of knowledge which does not base itself upon the strict processes of reason. The second place, between antiquity and modern man, is a waste of time, a tremendous desert of distances. We are no longer able to think as he thought, to understand what he understood, or to build our conclusions upon the reasonable courses of events which were sufficient to his needs. Thus, between the uncertainties of origins and the additional confusion caused by the destruction of ancient records, and also by the loss of our true living knowledge of ancient languages, we must present certain reservations on this problem. But with this group of reservations, we have also certain evidence, by means of which we may reasonably deduce or even induce that certain things were almost certainly true. And perhaps by contemplating the network of symbols, we shall begin to appreciate or apperceive the principles behind the patterns which we can now contemplate. We must not assume that antiquity was all-knowing, nor must we assume that antiquity was all ignorant. We must recognize that there are things we know that they could not have known, but there were also things which they knew internally, which remain unknown to us because we are no longer naturally and internalizing people. They had certain interior illumination, which seems to have led them far in the search of essentials, whereas the outer light of our thinking has carried us vast distances into things not so essential. For instance, we begin our problem this evening with the problem or study of the seven deities, or as Plutarch refers to the mystery, the seven-rayed God. Why was the seven so vastly significant a number in ancient times? How does it happen that this number coincides with what the ancients called their planets, consisting of 5 planets we know today and 2 luminaries? These 7 bodies in peculiarly close relationship to the earth and appearing to move around it have for the longest period that we know been highly symbolical and highly significant in relation to theology. These 7 wanderers, these 7 planets, by the Egyptians, by the Persians, the Hindus, the Chinese, the Greeks, and many other peoples, particularly perhaps even the Babylonians, these 7 planets were always identified with 7 deities. These 7 deities, in all these different groups, divided and organized themselves in practically the same patterns. And the powers of these deities, regardless of the names by which they were known, were identical. Thus the number 7 comes to us with a tremendous and almost awe-inspiring pressure of validity. We know, for example, that there were 7 principal deities among the Chinese. But their astronomy seems to have been a little better than ours of the ancient world. For they had the 5 ancestral gods corresponding to the planets. And they also had 2 other deities corresponding to the sun and moon. You'll remember the time of the Annunciation of the birth of Confucius. 5 old men entered in a vision, carrying or leading among them the herein, or keeling, a magical animal, a kind of unicorn. And these 5 announce the coming of the great sage. At the time of his birth, it is said, these 5 old men were on the roof of the house in which he was born. Now, the Chinese emperors, for at least 2,500 years, have celebrated the mystery of the 5 old men. They were definitely and distinctly the planets. These same Chinese people also intimated 2 mystery gods that were concealed behind other symbols. Perhaps these mystery gods were the 2 planets that were later to be discovered, Uranus and Neptune, concealed beneath the symbolism of the sun and moon, which served temporarily to complete the septenary. But we also know that in the Buddhist doctrine, there were 7 primary Buddhistic powers. These 7, the great eternal bodhisattvas, are never represented, however, in their fullness. We have only 5. Like the 5 old men of China, we have the mention of 7 Dhyana Buddhas, but we only have pictorial presentation of 5, arranged in the form of a hollow square, with the 5th in the center. Now, the Greeks had the same subterfuge of using 5 and 2 in a very strange combination. Philo-Judaeus tells us the 7 planetary gods were the vowels, or the 7 powers of sound. Is it not interesting, therefore, that we are still having trouble with our 7 vowels? We only recognize 5. And we have a funny old doggerel verse that has been used in school for a long time. The vowels are A, E, I, O, and U, sometimes W and Y. We've never been able to quite arrange this W-Y situation. We have, however, the 5 vowels that we know. Researchers, even in so conservative a field as Dr. Rhimes, in his extrasensory perception research, follows the old belief that man has 7 senses, but we can only find 5. Again, 2 concealed. And we are told that these 2 concealed sensory perceptions relate to the extrasensory gamut, or perceptions that are as yet in potential, but not yet in potency, in the life of the average human being. Thus we have a series of strange 5s that fall short of 7. And this peculiar situation has continued, even into the study of sacraments, where certain sacraments were for the laity and certain only for the priesthood. The ancient Kabbalah says that originally Moses wrote 7 books, of which 5 are the Pentateuch and the others are lost. The so-called 6th and 7th book of Moses that you can buy in paper bindings in some bookstores, this compound is a forgery, dating from the Middle Ages. But the 5 books of the law are said to have been only 5/7 of the original revelation. So this 5 again appears. And wherever this 5 appears, it has been tied to the planetary mystery. Now, if we wish to assume that the divine creative power was a septenary, let us consider for a moment what Pythagoras thought of the septenary. From the earliest studies of numerology, back in the classical period when folks really took it seriously, and at the time when it was applied directly to certain classic alphabets. And this is important because in ancient times men paginated and numeralized by means of letters, which we no longer do. Therefore pages were lettered instead of numbered, and every letter had its numerical equivalent, unvarying. We do not have this in English. But according to Pythagoras, the number 7 was the number of law. It was the number of the universe. It was the number of the gods and of the immutable principles which lie at the root of existence. Irenaeus tells us that one of the old Gnostic symbols of Christ showed the head of the Savior surrounded by a halo of 7 rays. These rays, assumedly, representing the 7 powers of the Messianic dispensation. We learn in the book of Revelation of 7 churches which are in Asia. And these, of course, carry very closely to the 7 chakras of the Tantric Vedantic system in India. And the moment we go into the problem of the 7 chakras, we come again into the 5-7 difficulty. Because our systems in Asia break up, some systems insisting that there are only 5 of these centers, and the other systems representing 5 developed out of 7 and 2 in potential. So we come back to this strange number again. And this number constantly fights the struggle between the 5 planets and the 7 members of the solar system anciently known and recognized. On another level, then, Let us go back to our Egyptian religion, where we learn that Ptah, P-T-A-H, the potter of Memphis, the deity who fashioned the world upon a potter's wheel in the form of the egg of Seb, the great mother goose. By the way, a little tie-up to our fairy story and our mother goose legends, because in several religions the world was created in the form of the egg of a mother goose. Rather curious. But folklore has stepped in and distorted these things almost beyond resemblance to the facts. But Ptah, who fashioned the world egg, similar to the world egg of the Greeks, which broke into the golden and silver hemispheres and gave birth to Castor and Pollux. But this egg, fashioned on the potter's wheel, was the work of the master builder, the master potter. And Ptah was the lord, governor, and presiding genius over the 7 Harmonian artificers. And these Harmonian artificers in Egypt were dwarfs, mysterious little beings represented glyphically as gnome-like figures, each of which held in its hand a bare knife, held in this kind of a position, upright knife. These were the knives with which the worlds were gouged out of space. And the 7 Harmonian artificers are said to have come out of the earth near the site of the Great Pyramid. They were the ancient ones, the formators, the fashioners of things. And there were therefore, among the Egyptians, beliefs about the 7 creating powers or laws. In the ancient Kabbalah, the creating fiat or word was spoken in the form of the 7 vowels, 2 of which, again, were mystery vowels or secret letters, which could not be known, and for the deficiency of which the great name could not be restored, captured, or preserved. In the Jewish early works in Genesis, we find in the opening chapters the Elohim. And the Elohim are the 7 creating powers of the great deity who is said to have fashioned the world in the opening chapters of Genesis. These are the spirits of God that moved upon the face of the deep. Their number is identical with that of the Harmonian artificers of Egypt. They were the powers or creating attributes released by the speaking of the word of creation. And this word was always a word composed of vowels. So we go back to the mystery of the 5-7 vowels. All these things point to some kind of a doctrine, which frankly and obviously is very difficult to trace after so long a time. But it meant something, and had a very clear and definite bearing upon the entire structure of the universal organization, as it was known to the ancients. Pythagoras, in defining this mystery of the 7, goes on to relate it to the 7 powers of universal generation. And in explaining this, he tells us, and Plato later corroborates it, that the soul was a numerical mystery patterned in the geometry of 7. That the soul of man actually consisted of 7 parts and an 8th sphere. Now this 8th sphere also arises in the ancient religious doctrine. The 8th sphere appears in the Gnosis and in the recent discovery of Gnostic books in Egypt, probably the most important religious find in the modern world, far more important than the Dead Sea Scrolls. These books, incidentally, were found earlier, slightly earlier than the Dead Sea Scrolls, but are not as well known. In this Gnostic collection, we have a very great deal of information bearing upon the esoteric use of numbers and of the various deities and principles that are represented by them. Pythagoras, who was perhaps one of the outstanding leaders of the study of number-letter relationship, pointed out that man in contemplation, energizing within himself but not speaking the vowels, that this energization moved into various relationships to himself, so that in thinking or internally sounding these vowels, he had the sense of their forming a pattern around him in space. Some of the vowels have to be thought or sounded above, others below, some before and others behind, some in the center. These vowels naturally by their sounds produce patterns that are of the greatest importance. In the Pista Sophia, in the Book of the Saviors, in the Gospel of Truth, the great Gnostic writings, we also learn of this 8th power, or eighth sphere, from above below. And this eighth sphere is called the abyss, or the dead world, or the world of darkness. And the eighth sphere is our planet, thus supplying to the ancient a mystery, which in the Gnostic ritual is sometimes called the abortion. It is the abode of the fallen spirits, and it is also, as Pythagoras pointed out, the sphere of generation. So he bestowed upon the seven energies of the soul an eighth power, which he called the power of generation. The eighth power of the soul being that which precipitates it into body and creates its association with physical and material things. Thus the eighth planet and your Yezids of Iraq, your various sects worshipping the diamond peacock, also know of the mystery of the eighth sphere, and we have intimations of it and hints of it in many places. We find it in Christian religious symbolism, where the Virgin, clothed with the sun and carrying the man-child in her arms, is standing upon a globe. This globe is the eighth sphere, which is beneath her feet, just exactly as it is presented in the Gnostic rituals. Now, if you go back to Revelation for a moment, you will come to the seven lamps and the great figure that moves among them. And we know that in the tabernacle and temple rites of the old Jews, the seven-branched candlestick is the symbol of the seven planets. All this shows a tie. It shows this tie returning. I talked to some of the medicine priests among our southwestern India. To them the planets also have peculiar meaning, although these Indians do not appear to be aware of any astrotheological symbolism such as we know. Still, these planets are superior beings, and why a light in the sky should so universally be so regarded, where it has no correspondence in human experience, can only tell us that either there was an ancient diffusion of this knowledge, or that man has intuitively developed it within his own psychic nature. And it is possible that Pythagoras being correct, and that man possessing a soul, which is archetypally sevenfold in principle, that this sevenfold archetype forces man to contemplate everything outside of himself in terms of a septenary. He cannot escape the incessant demand of discovering seven around him, because he moves from a point of seven within him. Such might sustain some of our thinking, and so we proceed to some of the theological systems and devices by means of which this particular and peculiar pattern is revealed to us. The seven great gods have always played their dominant roles, and each of these deities has had a common purpose or reason for the symbolism that has arisen around him. A very good description and discussion of this will be found in Godfrey Higgins' great work, The Anacalypsis, which is probably one of the most exhaustive and, for most readers, exhausting study of the subject that can be discovered. But Higgins, who had a monumental capacity for analogies, traced through practically every religion of the world, not only to discover the septenaries, but also to discover the numerical equivalents of the names of deities, so that these in turn could be fitted into this essential septenary pattern. His attainments in this direction, or in these directions, were outstanding. Do we have, in our experience, certain patterns on which we can build? What are the analogies that we really know, or believe that we know? Let us begin with one of the luminaries that perhaps will offer itself